we're just going to get started.
Excellent.
Tonight we're going to be talking about American values and the foundations of the country as the founding mothers and fathers had wanted it, although mothers' voices weren't recorded. But we will start there and review different historical documents that'll bring us up to date on what is happening in the country today and politically, the divisions or the unities that we all have, and we're just going to look at it from everyone's point of view. Everyone will be able to talk. Niles Shore is here. Thank you for bringing this program to the library. Niles and I spoke, and one of the biggest problems, I think, as a librarian, I hear different people's points of view and frustrations and people trying to learn more. And I'm constantly trying to deal with real news, fake news, and helping people to sort through the tsunami of information out there that can be really confusing. And I think the best thing to do is always to talk things through and have a place where we can all come together and speak respectfully and kindly and still maintain our passionate views. So that's what we're going to try and do. And Niles is, I'd like you to give your background rather than me talk about you in the third person.
Okay.
Do you want to do it with you?
I've got this thing.
Okay.
I'll keep seating if you don't mind, because I'm old with bad knees. So by training, I am a lawyer, and I spent a number of years doing what used to be called poverty law. So I represented people who couldn't afford their own lawyers. Did that initially in Pennsylvania. We moved to Georgia for a while, moved back to Pennsylvania. I represented people in nursing homes, people who were trying to get health insurance. And then I had the good fortune to be asked to go to work for a Pennsylvania senator in the state capitol, who was a remarkable woman and as close to a saint, other than my wife, that I've ever met. She had been a welfare mother. She was asked to run for the Pennsylvania Senate, and she did. And she won, I think, 3 or 4 times. I don't remember anymore. But she was the only person I've ever met who, when something went bad, never blamed her opponent. She blamed herself for not working hard enough and not being able to get them to see her point of view. That is not something most of us look at the world that way. And so maybe, during our sessions here, we will try to remember that the way things happen, with the way change happens, is we persuade one another. That's the way it was set up. But I'll finish my resume. So I worked in the Senate for a long time. I generally worked for the minority because it was Pennsylvania. But for about a 4-month period, we were in the majority. And life is much better when you've got power, I discovered, than when you don't. And I then went, after spending about 30 years fighting against the Department of Public Welfare and their policies, I went to work for them to finish my career. And it's an interesting experience to spend your life complaining about the way somebody did something and then have to do it yourself. It was a humbling experience and gave me great perspective, and taught me a little bit how to shut up from time to time. So that's sort of my story. And we can get started now? All right. So
Yes. So what we'll do is we're going to start with these foundations, but if you have questions or you want to make comments, I'm going to run around with the mic. And so thank you to BCM for filming this. And I want to make sure your voices are heard too. So we'll use the mic when we're talking. So I have comfortable shoes on and I can run.
So there are two things I'd like to do. One, I will not call on anybody, put anybody on the spot. If you don't want to speak, fine. At the same time, if you've got a comment or a question, I would prefer that you bring it up when you have it rather than wait till the end. And my general experience has been if you've got a question, 6 people have the same question that you do. And as they say, the only bad question is the one that doesn't get answered. So let's talk about why we're here tonight. This is an amazing turnout. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I, you know, when you do this sort of stuff, you sort of think, what are you going to say to get things started? So I've got the 3 reasons I'm here tonight. One is because Sharon asked me, and the library has been wonderful to me and Ann and our family, so I don't say no to the library. Second one is the Phillies aren't playing tonight. And to those of you who don't know what that means, Google it. But the third one is probably the most important one. And this is something that we talked about. I remember when it was possible and common for people to get together who didn't agree with one another and sit down, and during those discussions, you would hear sentences like, gee, thanks, I didn't know that before, or, I never looked at it that way, thank you, I'm going to really think about it now. And then the most important one is, I think you showed me that I was wrong before, and I appreciate that. So I'm hoping that during our time together, at least we'll be able to think that, if not, come right out and say it. So let's begin with this. What in the world is this? Part of what I've discovered over the years is that people have different points of view. And if you think about what's going on right now, some people focus on the now and look backwards and say, I remember when things used to be great. And they don't spend any time thinking about going forward. Other people focus on, there's still so far to go until things are perfect. I'm not happy, I'm angry, we should be at perfect. And then there's what I hope we're able to figure out, which is what I think is sort of uniquely American, which is we acknowledge how far we've come, and we recognize that we have a ways to go to reach perfect, and we will never get there. And that's a tough place to be. Okay. So let's look at these documents. So first, why did I pick these documents? First one is 1620. That's a long time ago. Mayflower Compact, we all remember the Mayflower. All right. When you look at this document, and it's very short, and this was an agreement by the people who are about to start a colony, and they decided that they wanted to set down what it is that they were doing and why they were doing it. And about halfway down, it reads, we want to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue to enact, constitute, and frame just and equal laws, all right, which shall meet and be convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. Full mouthful, but what does that mean? It means a group of people in 1620 decided, if we're going to do this, we have to do this together. And the purpose for our doing this is for the betterment of all of us. Do we still believe that? Do we still believe that that's why we have a government? Because there are things that we can't do individually, and the purpose of that government should be to generally make life better for the community as a whole? Is that something that any of us believe, all of us believe, some of us believe?
I think that is the
I think that that's the basic premise of what the government should be doing, but I think that as of recently, there's been disagreements about whether that's actually what the government is doing.
All right, and that raises an important point, which is there are two things you have to look at when you're looking at what the government is doing. One is, are they acting within their authority properly? And that's always a legitimate question. The other one is, are they making choices that you don't like, but that they're still legitimate choices? That's what I call policy choices. We obviously are not always going to agree with policy choices. Sometimes we get into a position where all of the policy choices being presented are bad. We don't like any of them. Sometimes we're lucky. You know, if you think back to, depending, I would say, maybe the 60s, early 70s for a while. Most of the choices were good ones. I mean, you could barely go wrong, no matter who was winning. It all sort of turned out okay. Some were better than others, but it all sort of turned out okay. But oh, yes.
Yeah, no, government obviously is kind of this monolithic concept that I think we misrepresent. You know, when something goes wrong, where's the government? And then we're bifurcated by saying, get government out of my life, get them out of my pocket, and all those kind of things. So we're not really clear as to what government should be in our lives. And anytime you give up independence for the betterment of the group, there's going to be trade-offs. And I think that's what we're kind of wrestling with now. What kind of trade-offs do we want? How much government do we want in our lives, and how much do we want them out of our lives?
All right, so the first question is, who's the government? Simple answer, we are. All right, so if we're not happy with the way the government is operating, it's our fault. All right. My general sense is, if everybody could commit an hour a month to just thinking about this stuff and paying a little bit of attention, it would improve what's going on significantly. All right, so who's the government? Is us. How do we change the way the government acts and the things that the government does? Obviously, the easy answer is you vote out the rascals and you vote in people. However, and I'll give you examples. It's very hard to find policies on which everyone will agree for a variety of reasons. The basic conflict in America is sort of what you talked about, which is how do we balance individual freedom against the community good? And if we're doing it right, they should be the same. If things are going well, we should recognize that to the extent that I do good, I'm in a position to make sure everybody does good. And similarly, if everybody is, if the common good is improving, that should truly be everybody. Now, historically, it hasn't always worked that way. But I would suggest that if you look back over the last 348, is that how long we've been around? It's gotten better over time. So that, if you look at the place of women in American society now as compared to 50 years ago, notwithstanding that there are things that people are very unhappy about, and I understand that. But as a general matter, I would find it surprising if somebody said the role of women in society is worse than it was 50 years ago. Yes, there clearly are some things that are worse than they were 50 years ago. But for the most part, you really think 50 years ago you would be in the position to vote for, first to have a female vice president and to vote for one? Again, let me also give a footnote. I don't want to get into partisan discussions. And in my mind, government and politics are not the same thing. Politics is about who gets in there to wield the power. Government is about what do they do once they have the power. So I'd like us to spend more time talking about what ought to be done by the people who have the power than talking about, who am I going to vote for 5 weeks from today? All right. Yeah.
It seems like at the time of the Mayflower conflict, the compact, they had kind of a blank slate. They had a group of people who came from England. They were not a diverse population. They were pretty much homogeneous. And so they had, I think, an easier time saying these words and actually believing them and thinking that they could actually accomplish, what these words meant. Whereas I think nowadays people have a much harder time because there are so many laws, so many ordinances, so many things that people have to keep track of. Just getting into their car every day and going on the road, they have to remember all these laws that they were supposedly learned, when they took driver's education, for that matter. And our population in this country is so much more diverse than the people coming over from, in the Mayflower, is that I think that becomes a problem for a lot of people because they feel like they shouldn't have to, or they should have to be inclusive of those people in the laws that are written, the ordinances, the people who serve in government, things like that. And it seems like we have a much more difficult time, trying to keep track of things than they did, 400 years ago.
Well, you raise an important point. And one of the things to remember is what government is about in many ways is who will have power and what will they do with it once they get it. And we clearly, in the last 50 years or so, have been going through a time when we are expanding the scope of who's on the list of who can have power. And people are having power now who didn't have it before. And the one thing that's very clear, and a wise person said many, many years ago, is power is never given, it must be taken, and in the taking you become strong. Meaning there's always a conflict about who will have power, and a part of that is nobody who has power has ever given it up easily. And if you look at, as I said, I worked in the Pennsylvania State Senate before. And one of the things that was clear is people don't want to give up the power that they have. And I would see people come in literally on gurneys to vote because they would be damned if somebody was going to take away from them the power that they had. And they would run again, even though, everybody in the world knew they were on death's door. And so when you talk about inclusion, I think what really is going on, is that people who have had power and privilege for the last 300 plus years don't want to give it up. Who can blame them? Sometimes it's men who don't want to give up the power to women. Sometimes it's white people who don't want to give it up to people of color. Sometimes it's native-born people here. By native-born, I mean people who've been here several generations who don't want to give it up to new people. But nobody ever wants to give up power. Why? One, it's fun to have power. But also, we basically don't trust one another. That is, we are worried that you will do to me what I've done to you, which is not a healthy way for a society to exist. That I've got to protect myself from you because I know when I had power, I was a real SOB. And so my fear is, so are you going to be one? Yes, please.
Yes, I just wanted to mention Jimmy Carter, who is voting. He's 100 years old, and he said, "I'm voting." That's power, and it's so noble of him. He's been a noble man, no matter what you think of his politics, and to want the entire nation, in fact, the world, to know that he's still voting. He's literally on his deathbed. There's something really wonderful about that.
Well, I'll tell you my Jimmy Carter story. Ann and I lived in Georgia in 1980. You may remember Jimmy Carter had been the governor of Georgia, got elected president in 1976, and was running for re-election. And Jimmy Carter was revered in Georgia. Nicest guy, you know, wonderful family, decent human being. But nobody would call him Mr. Charisma, which was unfortunate.
Mr. What?
Charisma.
Oh.
And if you don't remember the now infamous cardigan sweater speech, go Google it. It was a guaranteed way to lose. But in any case, we were in Georgia, and if you remember, I believe it was only Georgia and maybe Washington, D.C., maybe Massachusetts who voted for Jimmy Carter in those days. And in an example of full disclosure, I will say sitting in Georgia in 1980, I remember saying, oh, people are going to go into the polls, they're going to see the name Ronald Reagan and laugh, they'll never vote for him. So I'm not here to tell you that I'm great at predicting much of anything. But I believe that it's helpful to look at history and see what's going on. So let's look at the next document, the Northwest Ordinance. It's a little bit out of historical order because the Constitution sort of came next. But the reason for this here is July of 1787 was just before the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. In fact, I'm going to guess that most of the people who wrote this document were there. And they didn't finish their work until September of 1787. But at this point, they were doing the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance consisted ultimately of what became later on 6 states. Even though this document will refer to no more than 5, in fact, it turned out that there were 6. It was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then later on, Minnesota. And so this was the Continental Congress, which was the body that governed the United States. And it was the United States in 1787. Though if you like to Google stuff, some documents spell it out, the United with a lowercase u, and some spell it out with a capital U. The version of the Declaration of Independence that I've given you has a capital U, but it was just as commonly to be done with a small letter U. It was not until later that everyone sort of agreed it was going to be a capital letter U. So why I'm giving this to you is if you turn to section It should be highlighted in yellow. Now, the purpose of this document was to determine what was going to happen in these new territories that were a part of the country. All right, so let's do a group quiz. What were the original 13 states? Starting from the north on the East Coast, what was in 1776, not now, but then. What was the northernmost state of the 13 states?
No.
Massachusetts. Yeah, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. Tell me some more.
New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Rhode Island,
Connecticut,
Connecticut, right? Yeah.
North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And what you will see when you just take a look at this document is there was a general understanding that the rules that affected the existing states would be different than the rules that were going to affect any new states that might come in. We're big in this country on grandmothering in. So when we have rules here, you know, if the select board or the planning board decides to change an ordinance, it's generally looking forward. And that was the rule here. So let's take a look at some of the things. So now remember, this document was being written just before the U.S. Constitution was about to be drafted. Yes, sir.
Do you know who wrote it?
This one, I don't know the names, but it was the Continental Congress, and a lot of the same people were there. But I don't know. So I will give you a research tip, for want of a better phrase. There is a website called the Avalon Project. It's done by Yale Law School, and if you like historical documents, and they go as far back as Hammurabi, which is about 3000 BC, give or take. And almost anything you can think of is there, and that's generally where I go to look for documents. So I would recommend it highly. All right. So what was on their mind as they were doing this? Because remember, they're about to do the U.S. Constitution, so this should give us some idea of what was on their mind as they were about to reform the United States. So let me take a step back. Reform? Well, when did the United States start?
What? Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading.
When did the United States start? We just celebrated it a couple of months ago.
76.
July 4th, 1776. But here's the question. They never asked you this in school, and they should have. When was the Battle of Lexington and Concord?
April 75.
Yeah, so if April of 75 is when the fighting started, but we didn't declare our independence until July of 1776, what were we doing in all those months in between?
Starting a revolution.
Well, actually, we were starting a civil war. I mean, and that's, in the beginning, that's what it was. And there are documents from the summer of 1775 sent by the Continental Congress, one to the king and one to the Parliament, in which the United States says to them, of course, they didn't call themselves the United States in 1775, but the Continental Congress says, listen, guys, you haven't been really good to us. And that's, we understand it, but we want to remain a part of the British Empire. So how about you let up on the pressure just a little bit, and we can, go back to everything will be wonderful. And both the king and the Parliament decided to ignore those petitions that were sent in the summer of 1775. And then what happened, and this is something we can talk about maybe the next time if you want. Then a British citizen, who then became, I guess, a US citizen, Thomas Paine, wrote a document called Common Sense. And it was published, I think, in late 1775, but certainly by the beginning of 1776. Now, the number of copies of that, it's 46 pages long, though some scholars claim 47 pages. But in any case, the number of documents that were, the number of copies of that pamphlet that were published, the estimates range from 100,000 to 600,000. That would be the equivalent roughly today of a book selling between 13 million and 80 million copies in the first publication. Doesn't happen, right? Which also tells you how many people would have read it. If it was 100,000 to 600,000, more likely it was probably about 250,000. But there were 2.5 million people in America at that time, which means probably 1 out of 10 had a copy of that pamphlet. That's fairly amazing. You know, we talk about the internet and how we think that, you know, we're the first time in American history that information would flow quickly. When 1 out of 10 people in a society have a copy of a 47-page pamphlet, that's pretty fast. So what happened in early 1776 is that all of a sudden the country decided we're no longer satisfied with being a part of the British Empire, we want independence, which is how we got to July 4th of 1776. So when we became the United States of America, a few years later, the Congress passed what was called the Articles of Confederation. This is a phrase people have heard of, Articles of Confederation? All right, so roughly speaking, it was mostly really a military agreement because we were going into the, you know, we were in the war with Britain, and we were most worried about being attacked again by Britain, which of course did happen in 1812. But the 13 colonies that became the 13 states were not willing to give up power. And they did not play nice in the sandbox. I mean, there were all sorts of problems that they had with one another and difficulties that they had with one another. And there is a story that says the reason we ended up with the Constitution is now this is the Potomac River. And those of you who've been to DC, you know, one side is Maryland, other side is Virginia. Well, the story goes that when the surveyor did the boundaries of where the Potomac would go, they gave Maryland all of it. That obviously created a problem for Virginia because they didn't have a river to send their stuff down, their goods and their people. So as the story goes, remember this is now 1787, it's after the Revolutionary War is over. George Washington is now comfortably retired. That representatives from Maryland and Virginia went to George Washington, still probably the most respected at that time, and you could argue probably even up until this time, American, and said, we need you to help us figure out what to do. And George Washington agreed and had them come to what was the name of his house? I never remember. Monticello was Mount Vernon. So he had the representatives come to Mount Vernon. You know, they had tea and crumpets. Life was beautiful. They figured it out. And then all of a sudden it dawned on them, you know, if we could work this out, maybe we could work out some of the other problems that the Articles of Confederation are having with us. So I went through that whole long story simply to say, this will give us an idea of what was on their mind. So Article 1, no person demeaning himself in a peaceable and orderly manner shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments. That tells us what was an important thing that was on their minds. And religious freedom in the 13 states meant very, very different things to each of them. In some of them, it meant what this sounds like it means, which is whatever your religious background, perfectly fine, you're free to come, go do it. In others, it meant just the opposite, that the government would be closely tied with a church and that you were obligated to follow whatever the principles of that church were. Not what we would normally think of as religious freedom for the individual, but certainly not a bad deal for the church because they got to be in charge of things. All right, so that's number one. Number two is, and a number of these came out in the Constitution later on, but it's trial by jury, it's bail if you're charged with a crime, it's due process is in there. And no man shall be deprived of his liberty or property, but by the judgment of his peers. And then if the government wants to take your property, they have to pay you for it. Fairly extreme ideas for 1787. The concept that the individual had rights superior to the government. That's not something you would find in most countries in the world in 1787.
So when did eminent domain happen? Because it seems like this talks about full compensation rather than, whatever the government decides is they condemn your property and you get a little bit.
Well, we could quibble about if that's the way not being happy with what you get is not the same as whether or not there was a reasonable assessment done. But I don't want to have a discussion, an argument about.
No, but this seems benevolent when they
Yeah,
say that.
well, and when we look at the Constitution, which probably won't be today, when we look at it maybe the next time, it'll say the same thing. So the concept has always been that you will get fair compensation. And I agree, it doesn't always work that way, but this is certainly the first time in writing that the US government said that was an important thing for the rights of individuals. I mean, so if you look at Article 2, it's sort of in its own way the beginning of the Bill of Rights. I find Article 3 to be one of the more interesting ones. And it's, in many ways, a battle we still have today. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Pretty amazing that in 1787, the Continental Congress is talking about how wonderful public education is. I'm no expert on the history of public education, but there were not many states that actually funded public education in 1787. I know in Pennsylvania it was maybe 1820 or 1830 before there was funding for public education. I don't really know anywhere else, but a fairly radical idea. But again, look at the reason for it. We want people to be educated because it's good for all of us to have educated people. Now, I'm not going to be partisan, but you have to wonder whether that's something that universally people still agree. It seems that we respect stupidity much more than we used to. And that's as far as I'll go with it. But
I'll just say that I think when it comes to education, there's a real distinction between public education and private education that goes along with an elitism that is implied as well. Because you talk to kids and you know they go, oh, I go to public school. It's like a negative thing to go to public school where, you know, oh, I went to Exeter Academy or I went to St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's this elitism that's implied there, which isn't necessarily so.
I'll tell you a personal story. I grew up in Manhattan many, many years ago. And there was a school on the corner of 82nd Street and Madison Avenue called PS6. And if you ever look at celebrity funerals, I don't know why you would, but if you do, you will see across the street from that school is a funeral parlor. Frankie Campbell. Why do I bring that up? Because that was a public school, started in about 1930 or 40, give or take. And it was such a good public school that the parents of rich kids would send their kids to that school through the 6th grade, and then they would go to private school. And so I was fortunate enough to be transferred into that school. Wonderful school. They taught you foreign languages, and like starting in the 2nd grade. It was individualized learning, individualized reading. I mean, it was just a top-notch public school. And I remember, and then at the end of the 6th grade, you would go to junior high school. And most of the people that I knew took the view that it was too bad that the kids had to go to private school for junior high school because they weren't smart enough to make it in public schools. And I believed that then, and I still believe it about then. Why does that matter? If a society chooses to fund their public schools well and adequately, and provide adequate compensation for their teachers and adequate training for their teachers, no reason why public schools can't be superior. I mean,
I agree. I was a teacher.
and all that I'm saying is it has not always been the case that it was generally agreed that private schools are better than public schools. I mean, I would argue that the public schools in New York, certainly in the 50s and the 60s, were far superior to any private school in that city.
I'm not sure you.
Now, I will also say that the private schools got privilege and recognition far beyond what the public schools did, but the quality of the school, I will believe to my last breath that the schools then, the public schools were far superior, because at the time, the city was still willing to put the resources in.
And that's what I think is, it depends on which school you're at, as to what you get or how. I was an itinerant teacher, so I taught in 7 different buildings, and the principal and leadership, which is what we're talking about, is leadership in government, made all the difference in the world.
Sure.
I could go to one school and have supplies, I could go the next day to the other school and have brown paper, and that was all I had. And no matter what you talked about, they're like, well, we all get the same budget. I'm like, that's not the point.
Right.
The point is, what are you thinking? How are you governing here that this isn't working in this building, but it does in another?
All right, so at this point, I'm going to jump to something that I think sort of explains why America works.
Can Ross have a?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just wanted to concur with your opinion about the public schools. I'm not claiming to know it entirely, but I'm a great champion of the public schools. And maybe it sounds a little bit, I don't know, selfish of me to say this, but it's the same way in which I'm a great champion of libraries. Because there's no reason in the world why a public school can't be successful, and the same is true of a library. So that whether you land your child in a public school or that's weak or one that is strong and growing has everything to do with who got hired to supervise that school and the quality of the hiring practices.
All right, let me explain to you why I believe America works. And, you know, we all know the three branches of government and the Congress and the elections and all that stuff. All important, you know, separation of powers, all wonderful stuff. But the real reason America works is because the American people have an uncanny ability to stand up when necessary and say, enough already, no more. And I think if you look at when things have worked well in this country, I think all of you are old enough, maybe not all of you, but most of you are old enough to remember Senator Joe McCarthy. All right. And as a footnote, do you remember who the first person was who went after Joe McCarthy to try to bring him down? Exactly, and she did it in 1950, and the men in the U.S. Senate couldn't bring him down until 1954.
Can you say that name because it didn't come out very loud?
Margaret Chase Smith,
Make sure
you know, I'm assuming she was the first female senator from Maine,
She took her husband's place when he passed away.
and she had been in the House at some point, I thought. I could be wrong about that. And how did he get brought down? There was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Welch. Joseph Welch was a partner at a law firm in Boston. In those days, it was called Hale and Dorr. Now it's, I think, Wilmer Hale. There was a hearing involving Joe McCarthy, who was a senator from Wisconsin, Roy Cohn, who at the time was a 26-year-old lawyer who was very closely tied to McCarthy, and a young lawyer who had been taken into the army, you know, inducted into the army, and there was some question as to whether he was getting unfair treatment. So the army decided to hold a hearing to investigate what in the world was going on. During the course of the hearing, McCarthy decided the best way to protect yourself is to go after somebody else. So he found a young lawyer who worked for Joseph Welch, who had been a member of the National Lawyers Guild. Now, I'm guessing most people don't know what that is, but it's still exists as far as I know, and it's sort of the left-wing version of the Bar Association. It's where lawyers go whose politics is left-wing. So McCarthy decided he was going to try to destroy this young lawyer from Welch's law firm. And he started to do that. And at one point, Joseph Welch stands up during the hearing. Now, the hearings were televised. This is 1954, fairly unusual. And the estimate is that at least 80 million people saw part of that hearing. And it's hard to remember how pervasive and I will use the word evil, that Joe McCarthy was doing. I mean, we think things are terrible now. Oh my goodness. Literally thousands of people's lives were destroyed. Many of them public employees, teachers. Yeah, yes.
Remind us what McCarthyism was and what his intent was.
There's always a youngin in the crowd who doesn't know this. Joe McCarthy was an extremely conservative, right-wing senator from Wisconsin who decided that he would gain power and influence by claiming that the communists were taking over the government. And he very famously said in, I don't know whether it was 49 or 50, that I have a list of 205 communists. I think initially it was the State Department. But the point is he always kept claiming to have a list of communists in government, and of course never ever produced one. And this went on for 40 years. People had to take loyalty oaths.
The entertainment industry also?
Yes, that's where the blacklisting came from. There were famous hearings by what was then called, I don't think it's called this anymore, the House Un-American Activities Committee, where actors and directors and such were called before it and asked not only to confess that they were members, but to name names. And that created all sorts of stuff. So Joseph McCarthy starts to go after this young man, Fred Fisher, I think is his name, Fred or Frank Fisher, I don't remember anymore. And Joseph Welch stands up and says, "Sir, have you no decency?" And those were the words that began the end of Joseph McCarthy. And I've always believed that it's moments like that when somebody stands up and says, enough, no more. We're not putting up with this anymore. That change happens. Yes, sir.
I thought it was Margaret Chase Smith who said, "Have you no shame?" to McCarthy.
She made a speech on the floor of the Senate called, I think it was the Declaration of Conscience. She did not name him by name in that speech. So I can't tell you that I know she didn't say that, but the line that brought him down 4 years later was, "Have you no decency?" Okay?
Can I take a minute and circle back to the education
Yes.
piece really quickly? Because the way I feel it and hear and listen to today's culture and society, it's gone beyond just private school and elementary schools and public schools. What I'm hearing is a pushback on higher education and people that have higher education, and that it's almost twisting that people are feeling, oh, they're hoity-toity, they have a degree, or it's just this feeling of that no longer comes with distinction and respect that's earned. It's almost like a negative thing. Does anyone else feel that, or in this
Well,
political
I'll
climate?
tell you someone who does, which is President Biden. Because if you remember, one of the things that was very important to him was to figure out how to get people good jobs that did not require college degrees. And another person, and I'm not touting this as a future president or anybody, but Governor Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, one of the first things he did was the same thing. He told his staff, "I want you to find me a way that we can get people decent jobs without having to go to college." Not quite exactly what you're saying.
No. Yeah, that's not it.
Kind of the opposite.
Yeah, it's not what I'm actually saying. Does anyone else want to?
Well, I know that like going into the trades was not a thing. Like, for a while there, it was a push to go to college and do that, and to go into the trades was, thought to be the lower of choices. But I feel that might be turning around because I know several young people who are going into the trades.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's not, don't get me wrong. I'm saying I feel like there's pushback against higher education.
So, I just sort of found out about this man. His name is Curtis Yarvin. If you want to hear the epitome of someone who wants to destroy public education and universities, listen to what he says and to the person who he has influenced quite a bit. He'll be on television tonight. And the reason I think that there's a push for people to go into the trades and to skip college is because college is expensive and people just don't want to sign up for that much debt. It scares them. They don't think they can pay it off. There's millions of people who are having that problem. So if you're a young person and you look at that, you go, I need a solution. And the solution is to get into the trades, and you can do very well in the trades. If I was king, I would say go to college for 2 years and then go into the trades.
Well, you don't even have to be king. You can be the governor of Maine. Because Maine has what are called senior colleges. And I go every Monday to one in Brunswick. And it's held in the building of Southern Maine Community College. And there are big signs on all the doors that say if you graduated high school in 2020, 21, or 22, you can come here for free. All right, so that's sort of trying to split the difference. 2-year school or less, you know, you may go for a certificate, you may go for a degree, but it's free. So there are ways to do this if you choose to. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to talk about two things. One is, you mentioned earlier, and I'm probably going to do a bad job of trying to rephrase this. You said there comes a point when we have to stand up. How am I doing with that paraphrase? The truth of it is, as I see it, where we are in this country right now, there are millions of us who've come to that point and have trouble controlling our anger. And that was the most important thing. I need to go back to, sorry, what you said that caused me to have a comment. What were you, give me back to the focus.
Curtis Yarden and no public education.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I already was happy to tell you that I'm a champion of the public schools, but the other side of that educational coin is I'm extremely skeptical of anything having to do with higher education elitism. And the best way I would describe, one of the many valuable ways to describe that is to ask this question. I'll do it differently. There are charlatans who go to Ivy League schools. There are people that squander their intelligence by doing things they ought not to be doing. And on the other side of that coin, by the way, it's deep into me because I just finished a book called Growing Up Blue Collar, and I'm able to live through these issues. I've been thinking about it for 3 years as I wrote the book. One of the contentions I make in the book is there can be brilliant, humane, responsible people in community colleges, and there can be fools and manipulators in the best colleges, and we need to be eternally skeptical of anyone who says elitism. No one gets to talk down to me about community colleges. I will jump right in and tell them you're on the wrong track.
Let me respond to something you said. My grandmother was probably the smartest person I ever knew, and she always told me, don't get mad, don't get even, get ahead. So I will say to the millions of people who are angry right now, your anger isn't doing anybody any good. Do something. Do something that gets good people in office. Do something that gets good policies implemented.
My is my expression of anger, and that's a contribution to the debate. So to suggest that I can't be angry,
I didn't
do
say
I
you
bother to
can't be
write?
angry. I was suggesting that a more effective strategy than being angry is doing something that actually changes things.
kumbaya is not helping right now.
And if you think that the only way that people make change in this country is by, as you put it, kumbaya, then let me suggest, my friend, you study history a little bit.
No, I've studied history.
And you think
No.
only kumbaya
No,
is
I
the way
didn't
things
say
get
that.
changed?
I did not say that.
It sounded that way
We
from
either
here.
take the hardcore position that anger is all we can have, or we take the other one with people apologizing for being angry. That's not how America got started.
Okay.
Anger got America started.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just from my own experience, I went to college, I went to graduate school, and then I became a carpenter, which I've been for almost the last 50 years. And we were a group of, people used to call us hippie carpenters because we had long hair and beards and things like that. But basically, we were people who had learned how to learned how to think. And so when we were on a job, we knew how to put things together because we could solve problems. And I think all of you would be really surprised at how many college graduates went into the trades in the 1970s and 80s and were building, in this area, New Hampshire. I was living in New Hampshire at the time, but it was a wonderful experience because we had great discussions. People were across political barriers. There were some Republicans, or there were Democrats, there was independents. Everybody got along because we were all doing something what we considered positive because we were building things. And so I think when politicians try to say that we should find jobs for people who do not have college educations, I think they're short shrifting those people to have the experience of learning how to learn. And that's what school is all about.
Okay.
Just a quick personal thing. What college did for me really showed me how little I knew about so many things. And it also gave me humility because I thought I knew a lot till I got there. And so it kind of straightened me out. But it opened my mind, exactly what you're saying about learning. That once you realize you don't know everything, and it's okay not to know it, it's not a weakness, then you become a learner. And if you can become a lifelong learner, you're there.
And a plug for Maine, it really is a wonderful state for lifelong learning. Every county in Maine has what's called a senior college. York County actually has two. And it's peer-to-peer teaching on everything. I'm taking Dante's The Inferno, remembering the
uplifting.
1950s, Tai Chi, chair yoga, and making books, like binding books. You can do everything in the world. So yeah, lifelong learning is certainly something much more accepted and easier to do. And in Portland we have the Ali Institute, and they're certainly one of the national leaders in that. So it's now 5 after 7.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to stir the pot.
Well,
That's what we're here for.
That's what we're
that's
here
exactly
for.
what we're here
Some
for,
of
yeah.
these conversations come out of
It
the
is,
pot.
it is. This is great. You had your chance.
Just one more thing. I taught in a community college for over 45 years, and I have still contacts for students who I had maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And the success of some of the students is just, it's why I teach. And I still do, by the way, I teach online. But it is remarkable, the idea that if you pay more money, because that's what a lot of times private school is about, it's got to be better because that's our paradigm in our society. If it costs more, it's better. Not necessarily the truth. When my daughter taught in a private school, I had to teach her how to teach. The reason they hired her, because she was the soccer coach. Teaching science. It gets, I mean, it can, I don't want to take up more time, but it's not something that education, because I have two grandsons who are both in private school, they're paying $60,000 apiece to go there. And they're in one of the best school systems in Massachusetts, which is kind of ironic, but that's another discussion. But
Well, here's a question to think about. Neil talked to us about diversity in public education and that, to what extent has funding of public education been reduced because of the inclusiveness of the student bodies in public education? It's certainly very clear if you look in the South. One of the major tactics after 1954 was towns shut down public schools and open private schools so they didn't have to teach black students.
Miles, I was in Virginia when they shut the schools.
Yeah.
And fortunately, my parents were able to send me to a private school. But a lot of kids in my neighborhood weren't able to. And it was really a kind of a dark time talking about education occurred. But I'll never forget that Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, landmark kind of thing. But there's a case where a lot of people were not happy about that, to have diversity in their schools. I mean,
And they were not just in the South.
yes, I know, well, that's enough.
For those of you who've heard of Boston, it certainly did not distinguish itself with the way it dealt with busing after 1954. Yeah, and hardly the only one, just the worst. Okay.
Just wanted to agree with you in general, about the power of a community college. I know people, some of them are very close friends, who never set foot in a college, and they're full of wisdom and they're overloaded with expertise. And I've known people who've gone through college who don't show me that they learned a whole lot while they were there. We need to have respect for what we call blue-collar people. Because somebody never went to college doesn't mean that they're ignorant.
And I'm not here to defend college, but just because you went to college doesn't mean that you are ignorant.
Nope, never meant to imply that. Never.
Well, sometimes things get,
No.
we sort of take things to the next step.
The trouble is
I mean,
black
the
people-
point is what we should try to do is to deal with people individually, and listen to what they have to say and evaluate what they're telling us, and how they got there doesn't really much matter. How they acquired their knowledge doesn't matter. What matters is, do you have something worth listening to?
Couldn't agree more.
Good. Okay, now what?
Well, we have to make a decision if we want to come together and do it again next month. Like we thought about continuing this talk and giving people the platform to come and discuss these issues. And what we do is start with a topic, just like you did tonight, and we can even go further and have more people talk too. So
Well,
you were-
I had, if we wanted to do that, what I'm certainly prepared to do in terms of background would be to finish the documents we started today, which would be the next session. And then in the third session, I would like to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision about presidential immunity. And so I would be willing to summarize that. But what's more important is I would rather talk about things that you want to talk about. So I have no plans have given no thought to any topic beyond that one. And I picked that one because it's very long and I needed an excuse to go read it.
I think I'd like to talk about the Supreme Court kind of taking away all the different parts of the Voters' Rights Act that was enacted in the 1960s, and now they're taking away I think all of them are gone except for one. So I'd like to talk about that.
That might be an interesting topic now. The difference between states' rights and federal government. I think that would be an interesting topic because so many people today, politicians, talk about, kick it back to the states' rights. I mean, that's a big civil war. You all know about the Civil War. That was the whole kind of reason that the states' rights were then subservient to federal government. And does federal government have a right to tell the states what to do?
Yeah. So,
that
some
true?
of us would quibble about the way you've characterized it. Some of us would say that when the Constitution was written, there was an agreement as to how power would be shared and who would have the right to do what. And it's not a question of subservient or not subservient, because in some areas, the state government is superior to the federal one and vice versa. But it certainly has been a dispute for 300 years, give or take.
Well, as you know, Shannon Bellow, the Secretary of State, said that Trump couldn't be on the ballot, and it was overturned by the Supreme Court. The same in Colorado.
Well, but that wasn't a states' rights issue. That had to do with the wording of the 14th Amendment, I think it was.
Was that?
It wasn't a states' rights issue. But in any case, so my suggestion would be that you send Sharon all of your information, and your email is available on the website
Yep.
of the library.
Yep.
So there are several questions that need to be answered. Number one, do you want to do this again? Number two, do you want to do it on a monthly basis? Probably not more frequently, but less frequently, quarterly, monthly, announce your decision. And secondly, what do you want to talk about next time? Now, I would like to finish the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence just because I think it's background that's useful. So beyond those two documents, please tell Sharon what topic you would like to discuss. And as long as it isn't too obscure, I'd be happy to do some background, and we'll figure out a way to get that background information to people.
And maybe we can at some point incorporate these other topics too, like the federal versus state. Like
Well,
that sounded interesting.
if this is a continuing series,
Got
you know, 1 month this, then,
And I'll be here, so even if there's 3 people that come, we'll talk. I'm here every Tuesday night.
now if we continue the first Tuesday of the month, the next first Tuesday is Election Day.
We know how to pick them.
But the good news is the World Series will be over and the Phillies will have won. And 3 days of
course
celebration
that.
will be more than enough for me. So I'll be ready by November the 5th. But yeah,
So
When
vote
we-
early.
when we talked about this, the idea was to get some common background so that everybody could have an idea of what some of these policies mean, terms mean, history means. And I'm fine with that. I have no particular agenda in my own mind. I would like to finish the Constitution because I think it's very hard to understand what it's all about unless you've been read through it at least once in your lifetime. But other than that, this is your group, not mine. I'm just a guy who gets to stand up for an hour and a half. So please send whatever topics you want. Don't make them too difficult. I'm not that damn smart, but I'll be happy to do what I can. and we can go from there.
That'd be great. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niall.